The Nevada desert stretches endlessly beneath a canopy of ancient stars, where silence lives in the spaces between wind and stone. Here, where the Joshua trees stand like sentinels in the moonlight and the air carries whispers of secrets buried deep beneath the sand, something extraordinary once stirred in the darkness. Something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the possible and the impossible. In this vast emptiness, where government fences slice through landscapes that have remained unchanged for millennia, lies a story that has haunted the curious for over 30 years. It begins with a man named Bob Lazar, a quiet physicist, who claimed to have touched the future in an underground facility that officially doesn't exist. His story would transform a classified military installation into the most famous secret base on Earth, and turn the phrase Area 51 into a symbol of hidden knowledge. But was he telling the truth? Or was he simply another dreamer, lost in the desert's endless capacity for mystery? Tonight, as the stars wheel overhead, and the silence deepens, we invite you to drift into this tale of impossible machines and buried secrets. Wherever you're listening from tonight and whatever time finds you in this moment, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend these quiet hours exploring this mystery with us. Whether you're settling in for the night or finding a peaceful moment in your day, it's truly special to have you here. Let's begin this journey together. Long before Bob Lazar ever set foot in the Nevada desert, long before the world knew the name Area 51, there was only silence, a vast, empty lakebed, surrounded by mountains that had witnessed nothing more extraordinary than the passage of seasons and the slow dance of geological time. But in 1955, that silence was about to be broken forever. The place had no official name then, just coordinates on classified maps, and a simple designation: Groom Lake. It was chosen, not for what it was, but for what it wasn't. It wasn't near any cities, any highways, any curious eyes. It wasn't on any tourist routes or flight paths. It was, in the most literal sense, the middle of nowhere. And for the men who would transform it into the most secret place on Earth, nowhere was exactly what they needed. The Cold War was at its height, and America needed eyes in the sky. Soviet nuclear capabilities were growing, hidden behind an iron curtain of secrecy that conventional intelligence couldn't penetrate. What was needed was an aircraft that could fly higher than any fighter, faster than any interceptor, invisible to radar, and untouchable by enemy defenses. What was needed was the impossible. Lockheed's Skunk Works, led by the legendary Kelly Johnson, had designed just such an aircraft. The U-2 spy plane, with its impossibly long wings and revolutionary design, could soar at altitudes above 70,000 feet, far beyond the reach of Soviet missiles. But this miraculous machine needed a place to be born, tested, and refined away from prying eyes. And so, in the spring of 1955, bulldozers and construction crews descended on the empty lakebed like an invasion from another world. The first hangars rose from the desert floor like monuments to secrecy, massive, windowless structures that could swallow entire aircraft without a trace. Runways stretched across the hardpan, perfectly smooth surfaces that could handle the delicate touchdown of experimental craft. A small city bloomed in the wilderness, complete with dormitories, mess halls, recreation facilities, and a control tower that would coordinate flights no civilian radar would ever track. The workers who built this facility lived in a strange bubble of compartmentalized knowledge. They knew they were constructing something important, something classified, but the full scope of their work remained hidden even from them. Security badges determined where each person could go, what they could see, what they could know. So, it was a culture of need to know, where secrets were layered like geological strata, each level accessible only to those whose clearance ran deep enough. When the first U-2 took to the skies above Groom Lake, it marked more than just a successful test flight. It established a precedent, a proof of concept that would shape the facility's destiny for decades to come. Here was a place where the impossible could be made real, where the boundaries of human engineering could be pushed beyond all previous limits, where test pilots could slip the bonds of Earth and touch the edge of space. The U-2 program was just the beginning. As the years passed and the Cold War intensified, Groom Lake became the birthplace of increasingly exotic aircraft. The A-12 reconnaissance plane, sleek and black as a raven, could streak across the sky at speeds approaching Mach 3.5. Its successor, the SR-71 Blackbird, pushed the envelope even further, flying missions at velocities and altitudes that seemed to mock the laws of physics. Each new program brought fresh layers of secrecy, code names proliferated, Oxcart, Have Blue, Aurora, projects that existed in the shadow world between public knowledge and classified reality. The facility expanded, growing deeper into the mountains that surrounded the lakebed. Underground hangars were carved from living rock, test ranges stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. What had begun as a simple airfield became a complex ecosystem of experimental technology. By the 1970s, something extraordinary was happening at Groom Lake. The facility had become a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where aircraft could appear and disappear without explanation, where test pilots routinely flew machines that the outside world wouldn't see for decades. The F-117 stealth fighter, angular and alien-looking, conducted its maiden flights in complete secrecy. Have Blue, its even more radical predecessor, explored the bleeding edge of radar-absorbing technology. To the engineers and test pilots who worked at Groom Lake, the impossible had become routine. They flew aircraft with no visible means of support, machines that bent light around their edges, prototypes that seemed to violate every known principle of aerodynamics. They grew accustomed to seeing things that couldn't exist, to working with technologies that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. The culture of absolute secrecy that surrounded these programs created an environment unlike anywhere else on Earth. Workers arrived in unmarked buses with blacked-out windows. They signed security oaths that bound them to silence for life. They worked on projects whose full scope they might never understand, contributing pieces to puzzles they would never see completed. And they learned to accept that some questions were not theirs to ask. This culture of compartmentalized secrecy would prove crucial in the years to come, when even stranger technologies allegedly arrived at Groom Lake, when craft of unknown origin supposedly joined the experimental aircraft in the underground hangars. The infrastructure of silence was already in place. The personnel were already conditioned to work with the impossible, to see the inexplicable, to ask no questions and tell no tales. By the 1980s, Groom Lake had evolved into something unprecedented in human history. It was a place where the future was built in secret, where the boundaries between science and science fiction blurred beyond recognition. Test pilots, who had grown comfortable with aircraft that defied conventional understanding, were perhaps the only people on Earth prepared to encounter technologies that defied conventional reality. The facility had become more than a proving ground for advanced aircraft. It had become a gateway to the impossible, a place where the extraordinary was simply another day at the office. And in this environment, where the unbelievable had long since become believable, the stage was set for claims that would shake the world, claims that would transform Groom Lake from a secret military facility into a symbol of hidden knowledge and forbidden truth. The desert was no longer silent. It hummed with the sound of experimental engines, the whisper of aircraft that shouldn't exist, the quiet conversations of his people who had seen too much and said too little. And somewhere in that hum, in the space between the known and the unknowable, a story was waiting to be born. A story that would begin with a young physicist named Bob Lazar and a technology beyond human imagination. Robert Scott Lazar was born on January 26, 1959, into a world on the cusp of the space age. In the suburbs of Coral Gables, Florida, while other children played with conventional toys, young Bob was already drawn to the explosive potential of chemistry and the thunderous promise of jet propulsion. His childhood was marked not by quiet games or traditional pastimes, but by the acrid smell of rocket fuel and the satisfying roar of homemade engines. Even as a boy, Lazar possessed an insatiable curiosity about how things worked, particularly things that moved fast, burned bright, or defied gravity. His backyard became an informal laboratory where he conducted experiments that would have terrified most parents. Rocket motors built from scratch, explosive compounds mixed with the precision of a trained chemist, and jet engines cobbled together from salvaged parts. Neighbors grew accustomed to the sudden whoosh of experimental aircraft and the occasional rumble that shook windows throughout the neighborhood. His parents, perhaps, recognizing that their son's interests ran far beyond the ordinary, encouraged his scientific pursuits while maintaining a careful watch over his more dangerous experiments. They understood that Bob was not simply a mischievous child with a fascination for fireworks, but a young mind genuinely drawn to the fundamental forces that govern motion, energy, and flight. His bedroom walls were covered, not with posters of sports heroes or movie stars but with diagrams of propulsion systems and photographs of experimental aircraft. As he grew older, Lazar's interests evolved from backyard pyrotechnics to more sophisticated engineering challenges. He built motorcycles fitted with jet engines, creating machines that were as much art as transportation. These weren't mere stunts or adolescent rebellions, but serious attempts to understand and harness the principles of high-speed propulsion. His vehicles became local legends, strange hybrid creations that could accelerate with startling intensity and produce sound levels that brought complaints from miles away. By his late teens, Lazar had established himself as someone comfortable working at the margins of conventional science. He was drawn to projects that others considered too dangerous, too complex, or too experimental. While his peers focused on traditional academic paths, Bob was already thinking in terms of practical applications, real-world testing, and hands-on experimentation. He understood intuitively that the most interesting discoveries happened not in textbooks, but in the spaces between established knowledge and unexplored possibility. It was this combination of intellectual curiosity and practical fearlessness that would eventually lead him west. In the early 1980s, Lazar made his way to Las Vegas, drawn by the area's proximity to the Nevada test site and the opportunities for scientific work in a region where the experimental and the classified intersected on a daily basis. Las Vegas in those days was more than just casinos and entertainment. It was the civilian gateway to a vast complex of government facilities, where the boundaries of technology were being pushed in directions the public never imagined. Lazar claimed that his westward migration led him to Los Alamos National Laboratory, one of the crown jewels of American scientific research. Los Alamos, birthplace of the atomic bomb and continuing center for nuclear weapons research, was exactly the kind of place that would appeal to someone with his background and interests. Here was an institution dedicated to exploring the most fundamental forces of nature, where scientists routinely worked with energies and materials that existed nowhere else on Earth. According to Lazar, his work at Los Alamos involved classified projects related to nuclear technology and advanced propulsion systems. He described himself as a physicist working on the cutting edge of energy research, contributing to projects whose implications stretched far beyond their immediate applications. This period of his life, if accurately described, would have provided him with security clearances, exposure to compartmentalized research methods, and familiarity with the culture of government secrecy that surrounded advanced scientific programs. Yet even as Lazar established himself in the scientific community of northern New Mexico, questions about his background began to emerge. His claims of advanced degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the California Institute of Technology could not be verified through normal channels. No transcripts existed. No professors remembered him. No classmates could confirm his attendance. It was as if his academic past had been carefully erased, leaving only his word and his obvious technical competence as evidence of his training. This absence of documentation would later become a central point of controversy when Lazar made his extraordinary claims about alien technology. Skeptics would point to the missing records as proof that he had fabricated his credentials, while supporters would argue that his academic history had been deliberately suppressed to discredit him. The truth, whatever it might be, remained frustratingly elusive, hidden behind a wall of missing evidence and conflicting accounts. What could not be disputed was Lazar's genuine understanding of advanced physics and engineering principles. Whether his knowledge came from formal education at prestigious institutions, or from years of self-directed study and practical experimentation, he possessed a sophisticated grasp of complex scientific concepts. He could discuss particle physics with the fluency of a trained researcher, explain propulsion systems with the confidence of an experienced engineer, and analyze exotic materials with the insight of someone who had worked with substances beyond the ordinary. His colleagues at Los Alamos, those willing to speak about him, described a man who was clearly intelligent and technically competent, but also somewhat enigmatic. He kept to himself, focused intensely on his work, and seemed to possess knowledge that extended beyond what his official role would normally require. There was something about Bob Lazar that suggested depths of experience and understanding that couldn't be easily categorized or explained. Perhaps most significantly, Lazar demonstrated a comfort level with classified information and compartmentalized research that would prove crucial in the years to come. He understood instinctively how secret programs operated, how information was restricted and controlled, how projects could exist in the shadows between official acknowledgement and public denial. This familiarity with the hidden world of government research would later lend credibility to his claims about even more secretive programs. As the 1980s progressed, Lazar found himself increasingly drawn to the mysteries that surrounded the Nevada test site and its constellation of classified facilities. He was aware, as were many in the regional scientific community, that extraordinary research was being conducted in the desert installations south of Las Vegas. The exact nature of this work remained shrouded in secrecy, but rumors circulated among those with appropriate clearances about projects that pushed the boundaries of known science. It was perhaps inevitable that someone with Lazar's background and interests would eventually attract the attention of recruiters for even more classified programs. His combination of technical expertise, security clearance, and willingness to work on experimental projects made him an ideal candidate for assignments that required both scientific competence and absolute discretion. He was, in many ways, exactly the kind of person who might be invited to work on technologies that officially didn't exist. The stage was being set for a recruitment that would change Bob Lazar's life forever, and eventually challenge the world's understanding of what might be hidden in the Nevada desert. He had spent years preparing, perhaps unknowingly, for an invitation to step beyond the boundaries of conventional science into a realm where the impossible becomes routine, and the extraordinary is simply another day's work. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the desert winds carried the scent of sage and the distant hum of experimental aircraft, Bob Lazar was about to discover that some invitations lead to places from which there is no return. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be unknown, and some secrets once glimpsed demand to be shared with the world, regardless of the consequences. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in late 1988, cutting through the routine quiet of Bob Lazar's day, like a whisper from another world. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, offering no name and little context. There was a position available, the caller explained, for someone with Lazar's particular background in physics and propulsion systems. The work would be classified, highly specialized, and unlike anything he had encountered before. Would he be interested in learning more? In the shadow world of government contracting, such calls were not entirely unusual. Scientists with security clearances often received offers for projects whose details couldn't be discussed over unsecured lines. But something about this invitation felt different. The caller spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to choosing words that revealed nothing while promising everything. Advanced propulsion research, they said. Theoretical systems beyond current understanding. Work that could redefine the boundaries of human flight. For someone like Lazar, whose entire career had been built on exploring the edges of the possible, the offer was irresistible. He had spent years working with conventional technologies, always aware that somewhere in the classified world, projects existed that pushed far beyond the public limits of science. Here, perhaps, was his invitation to step through that door, to see what lay hidden in the spaces between known and unknown. The first meeting took place in a nondescript office building in Las Vegas, the kind of anonymous commercial space that could house anything from insurance agencies to consulting firms. Lazar arrived at the appointed time to find a waiting room that revealed nothing about the organization behind the door. No corporate logos, no mission statements, no photographs of smiling executives or completed projects. Just blank walls, generic furniture, and the quiet hum of air conditioning. The man who greeted him introduced himself only as Dennis. Middle-aged, professionally dressed, carrying himself with the subtle authority of someone accustomed to working in classified environments. Dennis spoke in generalities about advanced research programs, cutting-edge propulsion concepts, and the need for scientists willing to work under conditions of absolute secrecy. The conversation felt like a careful dance, each participant measuring the other, gauging interest without revealing specifics. What Dennis could share was limited but tantalizing. The project involved reverse engineering propulsion systems that operated on principles not found in conventional physics textbooks. The work would be conducted at a facility in the Nevada desert, a place so classified that its very existence was compartmentalized beyond normal security protocols. The pay would be substantial, the work would be unlike anything Lazar had ever encountered, and the secrecy requirements would be absolute. The vetting process that followed was exhaustive. Background investigators appeared at Lazar's former workplaces, his neighborhood, his children's schools. They spoke to colleagues, neighbors, casual acquaintances, constructing a detailed portrait of his life, character, and potential vulnerabilities. Financial records were examined. Medical history was reviewed. Personal relationships were scrutinized for any indication of divided loyalty or compromised judgment. Polygraph examinations came next, conducted in sterile rooms by technicians who asked questions that probed far beyond professional qualifications. They wanted to know about his political beliefs, his financial pressures, his personal relationships, his potential susceptibility to foreign influence. The lie detector sessions stretched for hours, exhausting exercises in psychological archaeology that left Lazar feeling exposed and analyzed down to his molecular structure. Between the investigations and examinations came more meetings, each revealing slightly more about the nature of the work, while maintaining the essential mystery. Dennis spoke of propulsion systems that generated their own gravitational fields, of energy sources that operated without conventional fuel, of technologies that seemed to violate basic laws of physics. He emphasized repeatedly that the work would require not just technical competence, but emotional stability and absolute discretion. The contract, when it finally appeared, was unlike any employment agreement Lazar had ever seen, thick with legal language about disclosure restrictions, security violations, and the severe consequences of breaching classified protocols. Much of the document was so heavily classified that even reading it required additional clearances. The specific nature of the work remained undefined, described only in the vaguest terms as research and development related to advanced propulsion concepts. As winter gave way to spring in 1989, Lazar found himself standing in the departure lounge at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas, waiting for a flight that appeared on no public schedule. The aircraft that would carry him to his new assignment was unmarked, operated by a contractor whose name meant nothing to anyone without the appropriate clearances. His fellow passengers were mostly silent, men and women who shared the cautious demeanor of people accustomed to working with secrets. The flight was brief, perhaps 30 minutes over the desert landscape that stretched endlessly beyond the aircraft's small windows. As they descended toward what appeared to be an empty patch of wilderness, Lazar caught his first glimpse of the Nevada test site, that vast restricted area where the boundaries between science and science fiction had been blurring for decades. From the air it looked deceptively peaceful. Just another stretch of desert marked by dirt roads and distant mountains. The landing strip where they touched down seemed to exist in the middle of nowhere, a ribbon of asphalt surrounded by scrub brush and silence. But the bus that waited for them suggested a level of organization and purpose that belied the remote setting. It was a government vehicle, white and anonymous, with windows tinted so dark that the interior was invisible from outside. The driver, wearing the kind of uniform that identified him as security personnel without specifying for what organization, gestured for the passengers to board without speaking. As the bus pulled away from the landing strip and began following a dirt road that led deeper into the restricted area, Lazar noticed that the windows had been covered with additional tinting, making it impossible to see the route they were taking. The message was clear. Passengers were not meant to know how to reach their destination, only that they were being taken there by people who controlled access. Absolutely. The journey seemed to last forever, and no time at all, a disorienting passage through landscape that could have been anywhere in the American Southwest. The bus stopped occasionally at checkpoints where armed guards verified credentials and consulted lists before waving them through. Each checkpoint felt like another layer of separation from the ordinary world, another step deeper into a realm where normal rules might not apply. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving through increasingly desolate terrain, the bus crested a low hill, and Lazar caught his first glimpse of their destination. Below them, nestled against the slope of a mountain range, were structures that seemed to emerge organically from the rock itself. Hangars built into the mountainside, their entrances camouflaged to blend perfectly with the natural stone. From a distance they looked like nothing more than shadows on the rock face, geological features shaped by millions of years of wind and weather. But as they drew closer, the illusion dissolved. These were not natural formations but carefully constructed facilities, their entrances sealed by massive doors that had been painted and textured to match the surrounding stone. The engineering required to carve such spaces from living rock while maintaining perfect camouflage spoke to resources and capabilities that existed far beyond normal government programs. As the bus pulled to a stop in front of what appeared to be an administrative building, Lazar felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension that he had not experienced since his earliest experiments with homemade rockets. Here was the culmination of everything his career had been building toward. The invitation to work on technologies that existed at the very edge of human understanding. But there was something else too, a growing awareness that he was about to cross a threshold from which there might be no return. The facility had the feel of a place where extraordinary things happened routinely, where the impossible had become mundane through repetition and familiarity. As he stepped off the bus and breathed the thin desert air, Lazar realized that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. Whatever lay hidden in those camouflaged hangars would challenge everything he thought he knew about physics, technology, and humanity's place in the universe. The invitation had been extended, the threshold was before him, and somewhere in the darkness of those mountain hangars, secrets waited that would soon shake the world. The entrance to Hef's 4 was nothing like Bob Lazar had imagined. After passing through multiple security checkpoints, he found himself standing before what appeared to be solid rock. But as he watched, a section of the mountainside began to move, sliding silently aside to reveal a corridor carved deep into the living stone. The transition from desert brightness to underground twilight was disorienting, like stepping from one world into another, where different rules might apply. The corridors beyond were sterile and utilitarian, lit by fluorescent fixtures that cast everything in a cold, clinical light. Armed security personnel moved with quiet efficiency, their weapons visible but not threatening. A constant reminder that this was a place where the wrong question could have serious consequences. Lazar's escort, a man who introduced himself simply as Dr. Tranquil, explained the basic protocols as they walked. The facility operated under strict compartmentalization. Each individual had access only to the specific areas and information necessary for their assigned tasks. Everything was classified at levels that extended far beyond normal government secrecy. The briefing room was windowless and soundproofed, furnished with nothing more than a conference table and a large television monitor. Dr. Craggle activated the screen and began showing what he described as background materials essential to understanding the project. The first images were technical diagrams of propulsion systems, unlike anything in Lazar's experience, followed by photographs of craft that seemed to defy every known principle of aerodynamics. The briefing materials spoke in matter-of-fact terms about extraterrestrial technology, recovered vehicles of unknown origin, and ongoing efforts to understand propulsion systems based on gravity manipulation rather than conventional thrust. According to the documents, these materials had been in government possession since the late 1940s, studied by teams of scientists who had made little progress in understanding their basic operating principles. One document particularly caught Lazar's attention. It described the origin of the recovered craft as the Zeta Reticuli star system, a binary system located approximately 39 light-years from Earth. The beings who had constructed these vehicles were described as small, grey-skinned entities with large heads. Their technology operated on principles that human science had barely begun to explore, manipulating fundamental forces in ways that seemed to bypass the normal limitations of physics. As the briefing continued, Lazar found himself struggling to process the implications. If even half of this material was accurate, it represented the most significant discovery in human history, evidence of extraterrestrial life, proof that interstellar travel was possible, technology that could revolutionize human civilization, and yet it was being presented as routine, classified information, just another government program requiring his professional expertise. But it was when Dr. Craggle led him toward the hangar areas that Lazar began to understand the full scope of what he had been recruited to experience. The hangar doors were massive, easily 50 feet tall, and constructed from some kind of alloy that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Dr. Craggle placed his hand on a scanner that measured bone density and length, a biometric system decades ahead of anything in civilian use. The enormous doors began to slide open with a whisper of hydraulics. What lay beyond those doors challenged everything Bob Lazar thought he knew about technology, physics, and humanity's place in the universe. The hangar was carved from solid rock, its ceiling disappearing into darkness high above. Along the walls, partially concealed by protective coverings, were shapes that could only be described as aircraft. 9 of them, each different in size and configuration, each obviously the product of engineering principles far beyond human understanding. The craft closest to the entrance was small and disc-shaped, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with a surface that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Its edges were perfectly smooth, showing no sign of joints, welds, or conventional construction techniques. The entire vehicle appeared to have been formed as a single piece, as if grown rather than built, Under the hangar's artificial lighting, it seemed to glow faintly, as though some internal energy source continued to function even in its dormant state. Dr. Krengle gestured toward this particular craft with obvious pride. This was the sport model, he explained. The vehicle that Lazar would be working with most closely. Its propulsion system was based on gravity wave amplification, a technology that humanity was only beginning to understand in theoretical terms. Lazar's job would be to reverse engineer the system, to determine how it functioned without the benefit of technical manuals or design specifications. The entrance to the craft's interior was barely visible, a seam in the hull so fine it was almost imperceptible. But when Dr. Krangle pressed his hand against a specific area, a section of the hull simply dissolved, revealing an opening large enough for a person to enter. The interior beyond was dimly lit by a soft blue-white glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Stepping inside was like entering a different universe. The ceiling was low, barely high enough for an average human to stand upright, and everything was scaled for beings considerably smaller than terrestrial humans. The seats were contoured for bodies perhaps 4 feet tall, with proportions unlike anything in human anatomy. There were no conventional controls, no switches or dials or display screens, just smooth, curved surfaces that seemed to respond to touch in ways that defied explanation. The central feature of the interior was a column that extended from floor to ceiling, constructed from the same mysterious material as the hull. This, Dr. Krangle explained, was the reactor that powered the gravity amplification system. It operated on principles that human physics could describe only in theoretical terms, manipulating the fundamental structure of space-time to create localized gravitational fields. 3 smaller columns, positioned in a triangular arrangement beneath the floor, housed what were called gravity amplifiers. These devices could focus and direct gravitational waves with precision. By creating areas of compressed and expanded space-time around the craft, the propulsion system could move the vehicle not by pushing against the surrounding medium, but by causing it to fall continuously toward its intended destination. The energy source that powered this impossible system was described only as element 115, an isotope that did not exist in nature on Earth but had apparently been stable enough in its refined form to power the craft for decades or perhaps centuries. When bombarded with protons, this element released energy that could be converted directly into gravitational manipulation, bypassing all the conventional limitations of rocket propulsion or jet engines. The briefing documents Dr. Angel showed him later that day included technical specifications that read like science fiction. The craft could accelerate from stationary to thousands of miles per hour in seconds without creating sonic booms. It could change direction instantaneously without subjecting its occupants to gravitational forces. It could become nearly invisible to radar and optical observation by bending electromagnetic radiation around its hull. Most remarkably, the propulsion system created a localized distortion in space-time that affected the passage of time itself. Clocks inside the craft during operation would run slower than clocks outside, a relativistic effect that Einstein had predicted, but that humanity had never been able to create artificially. As his first day at S4 drew to a close, Bob Lazar found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had encountered. He had been recruited to work on technology that seemed to emerge from a civilization thousands or perhaps millions of years more advanced than Earth's. The craft he had examined represented achievements that human science could barely comprehend, let alone duplicate. But beneath the wonder and excitement, there was also a growing sense of responsibility and isolation. He was now part of the most classified program in human history, privy to secrets that could change civilization if revealed. The knowledge he had gained in a single day was both a privilege and a burden, one that would shape the rest of his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. As the unmarked bus carried him back through the darkening desert, Lazar stared out through the tinted windows at the familiar landscape that somehow seemed different now. He had touched the future, glimpsed technology that rendered human achievements almost primitive by comparison. And tomorrow he would return to continue the impossible task of understanding machines built by minds that had solved the fundamental mysteries of the universe. To understand what Bob Lazar claimed to have witnessed at S4, we must first journey into the realm of physics that Albert Einstein revealed to the world in 1915. Einstein's general theory of relativity fundamentally changed how we think about gravity, space, and time. Rather than seeing gravity as a force that pulls objects together, Einstein showed us that massive objects actually bend the fabric of space-time itself, creating curves and distortions that cause other objects to follow what appears to be the straightest possible path through curved space. Imagine space-time as a stretched rubber sheet. Place a bowling ball in the center, and it creates a depression. Roll a marble nearby, and it will spiral inward, following the curve created by the heavier object. This is gravity, not as a pulling force but as geometry itself. The Earth orbits the Sun, not because it's being pulled, but because it's following the straightest path through space-time that has been curved by the Sun's immense mass. For decades after Einstein's revelation, this remained purely theoretical. Humanity could observe the effects of gravitational fields, but had no way to create or manipulate them. We could measure how massive objects bent space-time, but we couldn't bend space-time ourselves. Gravity remained a one-way phenomenon, something we experienced but could never control. But according to Bob Lazar, the technology hidden within the sport model at S4 operated on principles that turned Einstein's insights into practical engineering. The craft didn't fight against gravity or overcome it through brute force thrust. Instead, it manipulated gravity itself, creating localized distortions in space-time that allowed it to move in ways that seemed to violate every known law of physics. The heart of this impossible system was what Lazar called Element 115. In 1989, when he first spoke publicly about his experiences, Element 115 existed only in theoretical predictions. The periodic table of elements ended with the heaviest known substances, and scientists could only speculate about what might lie beyond in the so-called island of stability, where super-heavy elements might exist for more than microseconds. According to Lazar, Element 115 was stable in its refined form, unlike anything that existed naturally on Earth. This exotic matter served as both fuel and amplifier for the craft's propulsion system. When bombarded with protons in the reactor, it allegedly released a form of energy that could be converted directly into gravitational waves, those ripples in space-time that Einstein had predicted, but that humanity had only recently learned to detect. The reactor itself defied conventional understanding of how energy systems operate. It required no external fuel, produced no waste products, generated no heat, and created no harmful radiation. The Element 115 sample was apparently sufficient to power the craft for decades or perhaps centuries, without any measurable depletion. It was a closed system that seemed to extract energy from the very structure of space-time itself. This energy was channeled through what Lazar described as gravity amplifiers, 3 spherical devices positioned in a triangular arrangement beneath the craft. These amplifiers could focus and direct gravitational waves with the same precision that conventional technology focuses light through lenses, or radio waves through antenna arrays. By creating areas of compressed space in front of the craft and expanded space behind it, the propulsion system caused the vehicle to fall continuously toward its intended destination. The implications of such technology were staggering. The craft would experience no inertia, because it wasn't accelerating in the conventional sense. Instead, it was stationary within its own localized space-time, while the geometry of space itself moved around it. Occupants would feel no forces during the most extreme maneuvers, because from their perspective, they weren't moving at all. They were simply riding within a bubble of normal space-time, while the universe rearranged itself around them. Lazar claimed to have witnessed demonstrations of this technology that challenged everything he thought he knew about physics and engineering. In one test, he watched the sport model lift silently from the hangar floor, hovering motionless in the air with no visible means of support. There was no downwash from engines, no heat distortion from exhaust, no sound except for a faint humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, without warning, the craft tilted at an impossible angle and accelerated instantaneously in a direction that had nothing to do with its orientation. It moved sideways while pointing forward, shot upward while tilted horizontally, performed maneuvers that would have been lethal to any conventional aircraft. The acceleration was so sudden and extreme that it should have created sonic booms, heat buildup, and structural stresses that would tear apart any known material. Instead, the craft moved with the fluid grace of a leaf floating on water. During these demonstrations, Lazar observed something that Einstein's equations predicted, but that no human technology had ever achieved. The craft created a localized time dilation field, where time flowed differently inside the gravitational distortion than in the surrounding space. Clocks placed near the active propulsion system ran slower than identical clocks placed farther away, a relativistic effect that confirmed the tremendous energies involved in bending space-time. The visual effects were equally extraordinary. The gravitational lensing created by the craft's propulsion system bent light rays around its hull, making it appear to shimmer and distort like a mirage. At certain angles and power settings, the craft became nearly invisible, not through any cloaking device or stealth technology, but by literally bending the path of light around its surface. From a scientific perspective, these claims presented both tantalizing possibilities and fundamental challenges. If the technology functioned as described, it would render obsolete humanity's entire understanding of propulsion and energy generation. Chemicals, jet engines, even nuclear power would become primitive relics compared to a system that could manipulate the basic structure of reality itself. Yet the physics involved seemed to require capabilities far beyond human science. Creating stable gravitational fields would require energies comparable to those found in neutron stars or black holes. Containing such forces within a spacecraft-sized vessel appeared impossible using any known materials or engineering techniques. The very existence of stable element 115 contradicted theoretical predictions about the behavior of super-heavy atoms. Skeptics pointed to these challenges as evidence that Lazar's claims were impossible fantasies, violations of physical law disguised as advanced technology. They argued that gravitational manipulation on this scale would require exotic matter with negative mass, materials that might not exist anywhere in the universe. The energy requirements alone would be astronomical, far beyond anything that could be contained within a 30-foot diameter craft. But other scientists, while remaining cautious, acknowledged that the boundaries of physics were still being explored. Einstein's own theories had seemed impossible when first proposed, yet they had been confirmed by decades of experimentation and observation. Quantum mechanics revealed a universe far stranger than common sense suggested possible. Perhaps there were aspects of gravity and space-time that human science had not yet discovered. The synthesis of element 115 in earthbound laboratories in 2003 added an unexpected dimension to the debate. Scientists in Russia and later in the United States successfully created atoms with 115 protons, confirming that such elements could exist even if only for microseconds before decay. While these laboratory-created samples bore no resemblance to the stable isotope Lazar described, their very existence proved that the periodic table extended beyond what had been known in 1989. For Lazar himself, witnessing these demonstrations was both exhilarating and deeply troubling. He understood enough physics to recognize that he was observing technology that represented a quantum leap beyond human capabilities. If the craft truly operated as it appeared, its builders possessed knowledge of fundamental forces that could revolutionize human civilization overnight. The possibility of unlimited clean energy, instantaneous transportation across vast distances, and the ability to manipulate space and time itself lay hidden in those desert hangars. Yet it remained locked away, studied in secret, by compartmentalized teams who might never grasp its full implications. The tragedy, from Lazar's perspective, was not just that humanity was being denied this knowledge, but that the knowledge itself might be too advanced for human science to comprehend or duplicate. As he worked day after day with technologies that seemed to emerge from a civilization millions of years more advanced than Earth's, Lazar began to understand that he was not just studying machines. He was glimpsing the signature of intelligence so far beyond human understanding that their casual engineering achievements appeared magical by terrestrial standards. The craft he examined represented more than advanced technology. It was evidence of minds that had solved the fundamental mysteries of the universe, beings who could shape space-time as easily as humans shaped clay. And somewhere in the vast cosmos, that intelligence continued its journey among the stars, leaving behind only these silent artifacts as proof of possibilities that humanity had barely begun to imagine. For weeks, Bob Lazar had carried the weight of impossible knowledge in solitude. Each day at CEF4 he worked with technology that challenged every assumption about physics and human capability. Each night, he returned home to a world that had no context for what he had experienced. The isolation was becoming unbearable, like pressure building behind a dam, until the moment when keeping the secret became more difficult than revealing it. The opportunity presented itself through his work schedule at CEF4. Test flights of the recovered craft were conducted on Wednesday evenings when air traffic over the restricted areas was minimal, Lazar realized that the flight paths would be visible from certain vantage points outside the restricted perimeter. His first confidant was Gene Huff, a fellow physicist who had become both a colleague and friend during their time in Las Vegas. When Lazar finally found the courage to share what he had been experiencing, Huff's reaction was exactly what he had hoped for: skepticism tempered by curiosity, doubt balanced by willingness to examine evidence. Carol, Lazar's wife at the time, became the third member of what would eventually be called the Desert Expeditions. As someone who shared Lazar's daily life, she had already noticed the changes in his behavior since he began working at the classified facility. Rather than continuing to keep her in the dark, Lazar decided that she deserved to understand what was affecting their relationship so profoundly. The planning required careful attention to both security and logistics. Lazar's knowledge of the test flight schedule gave them a crucial advantage. Wednesday nights, typically between 8 and 10 in the evening, offered the best opportunities to witness demonstrations. They assembled video cameras with telephoto lenses, binoculars with night vision capabilities, and camping gear that would allow them to remain in position for hours. The location they chose was a ridge overlooking Papoose Lake, positioned far enough from the facility perimeter to avoid immediate detection but close enough to provide clear sightlines to the testing areas. The spot required a careful hike across rough terrain in darkness, following deer trails and avoiding established roads that might be monitored by security patrols. Their first successful sighting occurred on a clear Wednesday night in March of 1989. As they waited in position with their equipment ready, a soft glow appeared above the mountains that enclosed the test site. What they witnessed over the next hour challenged their understanding of what was possible within the laws of physics. The light source moved with fluid grace, accelerating instantaneously from stationary hovering to high-speed flight, changing direction without regard for momentum or inertia. The object performed maneuvers that no conventional aircraft could survive. It moved sideways while maintaining its original orientation, shot vertically upward at impossible speeds, and executed turns so sharp they seemed to violate the basic principles of motion. Throughout these demonstrations, there was no sound, no visible exhaust, no heat distortion. Gene Huff, watching through binoculars, provided a running commentary that captured both his excitement and his struggle to reconcile what he was seeing with his scientific training. Carol's reaction was more emotional, but equally profound. She understood that she was witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. The success of their first expedition led to increased boldness in subsequent outings. They returned the following Wednesday and again the week after that, each time refining their observation techniques and gathering additional evidence. The consistency of the sightings seemed to confirm Lazar's claims about the regular test flight schedule. As their confidence grew, so did their willingness to take risks. They began bringing additional equipment, staying longer at each session, and venturing closer to the restricted perimeter. What they didn't realize was that their presence had not gone unnoticed by the security forces responsible for protecting the facility's secrets. The end came suddenly and decisively on their fourth expedition. As they set up their equipment in what had become their familiar observation position, bright spotlights erupted from multiple directions, turning the desert night into harsh artificial day. Vehicles that had approached in darkness surrounded their position with military precision. Armed security personnel emerged from the vehicles, speaking with the calm authority of professionals accustomed to dealing with unauthorized intrusions into classified areas. The confiscation of their equipment was thorough and professional. Cameras, recording devices, notebooks, even personal items were collected as evidence. The interrogation that followed was conducted in a mobile command post. Lazar, Huff, and Carol were questioned separately, with particular attention paid to how they had learned about the test flight schedule. For Lazar, the interrogation represented a moment of decision that would define the rest of his life. The security personnel made clear that his employment at S4 was terminated immediately, and that his security clearance would be revoked permanently. But perhaps most significantly, they demonstrated that his communications had been monitored and his movements tracked far more extensively than he had realized. Phone conversations with friends and family had been recorded. His home had been under surveillance. The message was unmistakable. The government's reach extended far beyond the boundaries of classified facilities, into the personal lives of those who worked with sensitive information. As dawn broke over the desert and the security forces released them with stern warnings, Lazar found himself facing a stark choice. He could accept his termination quietly, retreat into anonymity, and hope that the government's attention would eventually shift elsewhere, or he could take the more dangerous path of public disclosure, sharing what he had learned with a world that might not be ready to hear it. Standing in the desert as the sun rose over the mountains that concealed S4, Bob Lazar understood that his life had reached a turning point from which there would be no return. The knowledge he carried was too important to be buried by bureaucratic secrecy. The desert had shown them wonders that challenged everything they thought they knew about the universe. Now it was time to share those wonders with the world, regardless of the consequences. In the days following his confrontation with security forces in the Nevada desert, Bob Lazar found himself caught between two equally terrifying possibilities. He could remain silent, accepting his termination from SF4, and hoping that the government's attention would eventually move elsewhere, or he could speak out, sharing knowledge that could change humanity's understanding of its place in the universe, while risking consequences that might extend far beyond the end of his career. The decision tormented him through sleepless nights and distracted days. Every conversation felt monitored. Every phone call seemed to carry the weight of invisible listeners. Strange cars appeared in his neighborhood with unusual frequency. Phone calls were interrupted by clicks and electronic sounds that suggested someone else was on the line. His mail arrived later than usual, sometimes bearing subtle signs of having been opened and resealed. But beneath the fear and paranoia, a deeper conviction was growing. The technology he had witnessed at S4 represented more than just advanced propulsion systems. It was proof that humanity was not alone in the universe. Evidence that solutions to Earth's energy and transportation challenges already existed, locked away in underground facilities by bureaucrats who seemed more concerned with maintaining control than advancing human knowledge. The ethical weight of this realization became unbearable. How could he remain silent when the knowledge he carried could transform civilization? The guilt of complicity began to outweigh the fear of consequences, pushing him toward a decision that would define the rest of his life. His search for a journalist led him to George Knapp, an investigative reporter with KLAS-TV, who had built a reputation for tackling stories that other journalists avoided. His work often focused on government secrecy and the hidden activities of federal agencies operating in Nevada. If anyone in the media might be willing to listen to an impossible story, it would be someone like Knapp. The initial contact was carefully orchestrated through intermediaries, using friends and professional contacts to establish communication without directly exposing himself to potential government monitoring. The early conversations were cautious and indirect, with Lazar revealing only enough information to gauge Knapp's interest and professional competence. Knapp's response exceeded Lazar's most optimistic expectations. Rather than dismissing the claims as fantasy, the journalist approached them with the methodical skepticism of a professional investigator. He asked technical questions that demonstrated genuine understanding of the scientific principles involved. He requested documentation and evidence that could be independently verified. Most importantly, he recognized the potential significance of the story while acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the claims. The preparation for their first recorded interview stretched over several weeks, as both men wrestled with the implications of making the information public. For Knapp, the story represented either the journalistic opportunity of a lifetime or a career-ending mistake. For Lazar, it meant crossing a line from which there could be no return, transforming himself from a private citizen into a public figure whose every word would be scrutinized by believers and skeptics alike. The decision to appear anonymously in the initial broadcast reflected both practical caution and psychological necessity. Lazar was not yet ready to fully expose himself to the consequences of going public, but he recognized that anonymous claims would carry less credibility. The compromise involved appearing in silhouette as Dennis, with his voice electronically altered to prevent identification while still allowing him to present his claims in his own words. The KLAS-TV studio on the night of the first interview felt like a courtroom where the verdict would be rendered by an invisible jury of television viewers. Lazar sat in shadow, his identity concealed but his nervousness visible in the careful way he chose his words. The questions Knapp asked were designed to elicit specific technical information that could be evaluated for internal consistency and scientific plausibility. As Dennis began describing his work at S4, the magnitude of what he was revealing became clear. He spoke of underground facilities carved into mountains, of craft that defied conventional physics, of propulsion systems based on gravity manipulation rather than chemical combustion. His descriptions were detailed and technical, delivered with the precision of someone who had personally examined the technologies he was describing. The response to that first broadcast exceeded all expectations. KLAS-TV's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls from viewers demanding more information. UFO researchers recognized that they might be witnessing the breakthrough they had always hoped for. Skeptics prepared detailed rebuttals, but found themselves struggling to explain away the technical sophistication of the claims and the apparent sincerity of the anonymous witness. More significantly, the broadcast introduced the designation Area 51 into popular culture for the first time. While the facility had existed under various names for decades, it had remained largely unknown to the general public. Lazar's revelation that the mysterious S4 was located near the more established Groom Lake facility suddenly gave the secret base a name and location that anyone could find on a map. The success of the first interview created momentum that carried both journalist and source toward deeper disclosure. Within weeks, Lazar made the decision to reveal his identity fully, appearing on camera without disguise as Bob Lazar, the physicist who claimed to have worked on extraterrestrial technology for the United States government. This second interview transformed both the story and the man telling it. No longer an anonymous source making unverifiable claims, Lazar became a public figure whose background, credentials, and personal life were subject to intense scrutiny. The decision to go fully public was both liberating and terrifying, freeing him from the burden of secrecy while exposing him to investigations that would dissect every aspect of his past. The impact on popular culture was immediate and profound. Area 51 evolved from an obscure military facility into a symbol of government secrecy and hidden knowledge. Tour buses began offering trips to the perimeter of the restricted area. Souvenir shops appeared along remote highways. The phrase Area 51 entered the lexicon as shorthand for conspiracy theories and classified government programs. But the transformation of a secret military base into a cultural phenomenon was only part of the story's impact. Lazar's testimony provided a framework that seemed to explain decades of UFO sightings, government denials, and unexplained aerial phenomena. If his claims were accurate, then every unexplained sighting might represent test flights of recovered technology being studied by human scientists. The scientific community's response was largely skeptical, but not uniformly dismissive. While most physicists rejected the possibility of gravity manipulation, a small minority acknowledged that the boundaries of known science were still being explored. The technical details in Lazar's testimony demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of advanced physics, even if his conclusions seemed to violate established principles. Government officials predictably denied all of Lazar's claims while refusing to provide specific information that might contradict his testimony. The official position remained that S4 did not exist, that no extraterrestrial materials were in government possession, and that all activities at Area 51 were classified military projects. But the blanket denials seemed to lack the specificity that would have been expected if the claims were entirely fabricated. As the story spread through media outlets around the world, Bob Lazar found himself transformed from an anonymous physicist into a reluctant celebrity whose name would be forever linked to questions about government secrecy and extraterrestrial life. He had succeeded in sharing knowledge that he believed the world deserved to possess, but the personal cost was higher than he had anticipated. The decision to break his silence had been motivated by conscience rather than ambition, by a belief that extraordinary knowledge should not remain hidden from the civilization that could benefit from it. In making the choice to speak publicly about what he had witnessed, Bob Lazar had crossed a threshold that separated his life into before and after. The quiet physicist who had once worked in anonymity had become the face of humanity's most persistent question: are we alone in the universe? And if not, what is being kept from us? The desert still kept its secrets, but now those secrets had a voice, and that voice belonged to a man who had decided that some knowledge was too important to remain buried in the silence of classified facilities. The moment Bob Lazar revealed his identity on television, he stepped from the shadows into a hurricane of scrutiny that would consume the next decade of his life. Within hours of the broadcast, investigators from every conceivable background began dissecting his claims, his credentials, and his character with the intensity of archaeologists examining ancient artifacts. The quiet physicist who had hoped to simply share extraordinary knowledge with the world found himself at the center of a battle between believers and skeptics that would define how his story was remembered. The believers came first, drawn by the technical precision of his testimony and the apparent sincerity of his delivery. UFO researchers who had spent decades searching for credible insider testimony saw in Lazar exactly what they had been hoping to find. Here was someone with apparent scientific credentials, security clearances, and detailed knowledge of classified facilities. More importantly, he wasn't seeking fame or fortune, wasn't promoting books or lecture tours, and seemed genuinely reluctant to be in the public eye. Stanton Friedman, one of the most respected researchers in the UFO community, initially expressed cautious optimism about Lazar's claims. The technical details about gravity, propulsion, and element 115 demonstrated sophisticated understanding of advanced physics concepts. The descriptions of S4's layout and security procedures matched what would be expected from someone with legitimate insider access. For researchers who had grown weary of wild claims from unreliable sources, Lazar represented a potential breakthrough, but the enthusiasm of believers was matched by the determination of skeptics who saw Lazar's story as either delusion or deliberate deception. The first line of attack focused on his educational background, the foundation upon which all his other claims rested. If he truly held advanced degrees in physics from MIT and Caltech, as he claimed, then his technical knowledge could be explained through conventional education. But if those credentials were fabricated, then everything else he said became suspect. The investigation into his academic history began almost immediately after his identity was revealed. Reporters contacted admissions offices at both institutions, requesting verification of his attendance and graduation. The responses were swift and definitive. Neither MIT nor Caltech had any record of Robert Scott Lazar ever attending their schools. No transcripts existed, no professors remembered him, no classmates could confirm his presence in their programs. The absence of academic records created a puzzle that would never be fully solved. Lazar claimed that his educational history had been deliberately erased as part of a government effort to discredit him. He pointed to inconsistencies in other aspects of his background as evidence of systematic suppression. Supporting this theory was the documented fact that his employment at Los Alamos National Laboratory, while confirmed through phone directories and newspaper articles, had also been officially denied by laboratory spokespeople. Skeptics argued that the missing records proved Lazar had never attended these prestigious institutions, suggesting instead that he might have taken courses at community colleges or learned physics through self-study. They pointed out that the absence of documentation was more easily explained by fabrication than by a massive government conspiracy to erase an individual's past. The burden of proof, they argued, lay with Lazar to demonstrate his credentials, not with others to prove their absence. The controversy over his education was soon joined by questions about his employment history and professional qualifications. While his work at Los Alamos was documented through various sources, the exact nature of his role remained unclear. Some evidence suggested he had worked as a technician or contractor rather than as a physicist. His understanding of advanced concepts, while impressive, could potentially be explained through practical experience and independent study rather than formal academic training. As investigators dug deeper into his background, other inconsistencies emerged. Financial records showed periods of instability that seemed inconsistent with steady employment in high-level government positions. Personal relationships had been strained by his secretive behavior and unexplained absences. Friends and colleagues described someone who was clearly intelligent and technically competent, but also somewhat mysterious about his past and present activities. The legal troubles that followed Lazar's public disclosure added another layer of complexity to his story. In the early 1990s, he was arrested and charged with aiding and abetting a prostitution operation. The charges had nothing to do with UFOs or classified information, but they provided his critics with ammunition to attack his character and credibility. The timing of the arrest, coming so soon after his revelations about S4, led some supporters to suspect that he was being deliberately targeted for harassment. Lazar's defenders argued that the legal troubles were part of a coordinated campaign to discredit him and discourage others from speaking out about classified programs. They pointed to the pattern of surveillance and harassment that had begun even before he went public, suggesting that his prosecution was motivated more by his revelations than by his alleged crimes. Whether the charges were legitimate or vindictive, they certainly served to tarnish his reputation and distract from the technical content of his claims. The systematic attack on Lazar's credibility had the effect his critics intended. Media coverage increasingly focused on questions about his background, rather than the specifics of what he claimed to have witnessed at S4. Debates about his educational credentials overshadowed discussions of gravity, propulsion, and element 115. The controversy became more compelling than the content, transforming a story about potentially revolutionary technology into a character assassination wrapped in scientific jargon. Mainstream scientists, already skeptical of claims that seemed to violate established physical laws, found additional reasons to dismiss Lazar's testimony entirely. If he had lied about his educational background, they reasoned, why should anyone believe his descriptions of impossible technologies? The scientific establishment, protective of its own credibility and wary of association with fringe claims, largely wrote off Lazar as either a con artist or a deluded individual seeking attention through elaborate fabrication. Yet even as his credibility crumbled under sustained attack, some aspects of Lazar's story proved remarkably resistant to debunking. His descriptions of hand scanners and biometric security systems, dismissed as fantasy in 1989, were confirmed years later when similar technologies became widespread. His claims about Element 115, ridiculed as impossible, gained new relevance when scientists successfully synthesized the element in laboratory conditions in 2003. More intriguingly, some of the technical details in his testimony demonstrated knowledge that seemed difficult to acquire through conventional sources. His understanding of classified military programs, while not necessarily accurate in all details, suggested familiarity with government operations that went beyond public information. The internal consistency of his descriptions, maintained across multiple interviews and documentaries over decades, indicated either remarkable memory or careful preparation that seemed inconsistent with deliberate deception. The human cost of Lazar's decision to go public became increasingly apparent as the years passed. His career in legitimate scientific research was effectively ended by the controversy surrounding his claims. Employment opportunities disappeared as potential employers became wary of association with such a polarizing figure. Personal relationships suffered under the constant pressure of public scrutiny and media attention. Friends and family members found themselves drawn into the controversy, questioned by reporters and investigators seeking additional information about Lazar's background and behavior. The surveillance that had begun during his employment at S4 continued long after his termination, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and isolation that affected everyone in his orbit. The psychological toll of living under constant scrutiny while defending claims that few people were prepared to accept was enormous. Perhaps most tragically, the focus on Lazar's credibility obscured what should have been the central questions raised by his testimony. If even a fraction of what he claimed was accurate, the implications for human understanding of physics, technology, and our place in the universe would be profound. Instead of serious scientific investigation into the possibilities he had outlined, the debate evolved into character assassination and credential verification. The polarization around Lazar's story reflected broader tensions in American society about government secrecy, scientific authority, and the reliability of institutional information. Believers saw him as a courageous whistleblower who had sacrificed his career to reveal vital information that the government wanted to keep hidden. Skeptics viewed him as a symbol of how easily people could be deceived by charismatic individuals making extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. As the initial excitement of his revelations faded into ongoing controversy, Bob Lazar found himself trapped between two equally problematic positions. He could not prove his claims through conventional means, since the evidence existed only in classified facilities he no longer had access to, but he also could not retract his testimony without admitting to elaborate deception that would destroy what remained of his reputation and potentially expose him to legal consequences. The storm of scrutiny that followed his public disclosure had transformed him from a man with an incredible story into a permanent fixture of UFO folklore, forever associated with questions he could not definitively answer and claims he could not conclusively prove. The truth, whatever it might be, remained as elusive as the craft he claimed to have studied in the desert darkness, visible only to those willing to look beyond the controversy and consider the possibility that some secrets are worth the price of revelation. In the quiet moments between accusations and investigations, Bob Lazar must have wondered if the knowledge he had tried to share with the world was worth the personal destruction that had followed. The answer, like so many aspects of his story, remained hidden in the silence between belief and skepticism, between extraordinary claims and ordinary proof. The aftermath of fame, Bob Lazar would later reflect, was nothing like he had imagined. When he first decided to speak publicly about his experiences at S4, he had envisioned a brief period of attention followed by serious scientific investigation of his claims. Instead, he found himself trapped in a kind of twilight existence, too notorious to disappear completely, but too controversial to be embraced by mainstream society. The man who had hoped to share knowledge that could transform humanity discovered that some revelations carry a price that extends far beyond the moment of disclosure. The surveillance that had begun during his employment at the classified facility did not end with his termination or his public testimony. If anything, it intensified after his appearance on television, as if speaking out had confirmed his status as a permanent security threat. The signs were subtle, but persistent. Phone calls that ended abruptly when answered, Mail that arrived opened and resealed. Cars with tinted windows that appeared in his neighborhood with suspicious frequency. His home became a place where privacy could never be assumed. Conversations with family members were conducted with the understanding that others might be listening. Personal relationships suffered under the constant weight of surveillance, as friends and relatives grew uncomfortable with the possibility that their association with Lazar might subject them to similar scrutiny. The psychological pressure of living under constant observation created a climate of paranoia that affected every aspect of daily life. The harassment took forms both overt and subtle. Phone calls in the middle of the night with no one on the other end, packages that went missing or arrived damaged, computer problems that seemed to occur with unusual frequency, power outages that affected only his home, while neighboring houses remained lit. Whether these incidents were orchestrated or coincidental, they created a persistent sense of unease that made normal life nearly impossible. Professional opportunities dried up almost immediately after his public disclosure. The scientific community, already skeptical of his claims, wanted nothing to do with someone whose credibility had been so thoroughly questioned. Government contractors, wary of security complications, avoided hiring anyone associated with leaked classified information. Even private companies hesitated to employ someone who had become synonymous with conspiracy theories and unverifiable claims. The isolation extended beyond professional circles into his personal life. Friends who had once enjoyed his company began to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the attention and controversy that surrounded him. Family gatherings became strained affairs where certain topics were simply not discussed. His marriage, already stressed by the secrecy of his work at S4 and the pressure of his public revelations, eventually could not survive the constant scrutiny and suspicion. It was in this climate of professional exile and personal isolation that Lazar made the decision to start over in a different field entirely. If the scientific establishment would not accept him, and if government work was permanently closed to him, then he would create his own path forward. The result was United Nuclear Scientific Equipment and Supplies, a small company that sold laboratory equipment, chemicals, and educational materials to schools, hobbyists, and small research facilities. The choice to enter the scientific supply business was both practical and symbolic. It allowed him to remain connected to the world of science and technology, while avoiding the credential requirements and security clearances that had become barriers to conventional employment. More importantly, it gave him a degree of independence that traditional employment could never provide. He could control his own schedule, choose his own projects, and avoid the complications that came with working for others. United Nuclear started small, operating out of a modest facility in New Mexico before eventually relocating to Nevada. The business reflected Lazar's lifelong fascination with chemistry and physics, offering everything from basic laboratory glassware to exotic chemicals that were difficult to obtain elsewhere. His technical knowledge and practical experience made him uniquely qualified to serve customers who needed specialized materials for legitimate research projects. But even in this new career, the shadow of his past remained inescapable. Regulatory agencies seemed to take unusual interest in his business practices. Shipments were delayed or inspected with frequency that other suppliers rarely experienced. Customers sometimes expressed surprise at discovering that their chemical supplier was the same. Bob Lazar, who claimed to have worked on alien spacecraft. The controversy followed him like a persistent echo, affecting every aspect of his new professional life. The psychological toll of carrying unverifiable but consistent testimony about extraordinary experiences proved to be one of the heaviest burdens Lazar faced. Unlike many people who make dramatic claims and then modify their stories over time, Lazar never wavered in the essential details of what he said he had witnessed at S4. This consistency, while lending credibility to his account in the eyes of some observers, also meant that he could never escape or minimize the implications of his testimony. Every interview request forced him to relive experiences that the world seemed unwilling to accept. Every documentary or news story about Area 51 brought fresh attention and renewed skepticism. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming part of popular culture in ways that extended far beyond Lazar's original intentions. He had become a reluctant symbol, forever associated with questions about government secrecy and extraterrestrial technology. As the years passed, Lazar developed strategies for managing the constant attention while protecting what remained of his privacy. He gave interviews sparingly, usually only when convinced that the interviewer was serious about exploring the technical aspects of his claims, rather than sensationalizing the controversy. He avoided UFO conferences and public appearances that might be interpreted as attempts to profit from his notoriety. Most importantly, he tried to maintain as normal a life as possible, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped his public identity. The weight of carrying knowledge that few people were prepared to accept created a unique form of isolation. Lazar understood things about physics and technology that, if true, represented revolutionary advances in human understanding, yet he could not prove these insights through conventional means. Since the evidence existed only in classified facilities he no longer had access to. The frustration of possessing potentially transformative knowledge, while being unable to act on it, was a constant source of internal tension. Friends and family members who knew him well observed changes in his personality and demeanor over the years. The enthusiastic young scientist who had once built jet engines in his backyard gave way to a more cautious and measured individual. He became expert at deflecting questions, changing subjects, and avoiding discussions that might lead to uncomfortable territory. The spontaneous curiosity that had defined his early career was tempered by hard experience with the consequences of speaking too freely. Yet, despite the personal costs, Lazar never publicly recanted his testimony or claimed that he had fabricated his experiences. In rare moments of reflection, when pressed by interviewers or documentary filmmakers, he maintained that he had simply reported what he had witnessed. He expressed regret not for speaking out, but for the naivety that had led him to believe the world would respond rationally to extraordinary claims. The business provided a refuge from the controversy, a place where he could engage with science and technology without constantly defending his past or explaining his background. Customers who needed specialized chemicals or equipment cared more about product quality and delivery times than about UFO stories. The work was satisfying in ways that his brief time at S4, despite its extraordinary nature, had never been. As the decades passed, Lazar's role in the ongoing discussion about government secrecy and unidentified aerial phenomena evolved from active participant to historical figure. Younger researchers and journalists would seek him out for interviews, curious about the man whose revelations had helped transform Area 51 from an obscure military facility into a cultural phenomenon. His responses became increasingly philosophical, focused less on convincing others of specific claims and more on encouraging independent thinking and scientific curiosity. The loneliness of carrying extraordinary knowledge while living an ordinary life created a unique perspective on the relationship between truth and social acceptance. Lazar had learned firsthand that some truths are too strange for immediate acceptance, too challenging to established beliefs, too threatening to existing power structures. He had discovered that speaking difficult truths often requires accepting isolation as the price of honesty. In quiet moments, surrounded by the familiar equipment and chemicals of his scientific supply business, Bob Lazar sometimes reflected on the path his life had taken. The young physicist who had once dreamed of revolutionizing human understanding through breakthrough discoveries had instead become a cautionary tale about the costs of revelation. Whether his extraordinary claims would ultimately be vindicated or forgotten, he had learned that some knowledge comes with a lifetime warranty of solitude. The desert wind still carried whispers of secrets buried in underground facilities, but Bob Lazar had found a different kind of peace in the simple act of supplying the tools that allowed others to explore the mysteries of science. He had spoken his truth, paid the price for revelation, and settled into the long silence that follows when extraordinary claims meet ordinary skepticism. The shadows had become familiar companions, and in their darkness, he had found a way to continue living with knowledge that the world might never be ready to accept. For nearly 3 decades, Bob Lazar's extraordinary claims existed in a kind of scientific purgatory, too detailed to dismiss entirely but too extraordinary to accept without reservation. He had described technologies that seemed to violate known physics, facilities that officially didn't exist, and government programs that no authority would acknowledge. But then, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, that world began to change. The shift started with subtle alterations in official language and policy. Government agencies that had once categorically denied the existence of unexplained aerial phenomena began using more measured terms. The absolute certainty that had characterized decades of official denials gave way to more nuanced positions that left room for mystery. The first major crack in the wall of silence came in December of 2017, when the New York Times published a bombshell report revealing the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The Pentagon had secretly spent $22 million investigating reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, while publicly dismissing UFO reports. For the first time in decades, government UFO research was being reported as legitimate news rather than tabloid curiosity. But the real transformation came with the release of videos that seemed to document exactly the kind of impossible flight characteristics that Bob Lazar had described 30 years earlier. The now famous FLIR 1 gimbal and go-fast videos, captured by military sensors and confirmed as authentic by Pentagon officials, showed objects performing maneuvers that defied conventional understanding of aerodynamics and propulsion. The craft in these videos moved with the same fluid grace that Lazar had described, witnessing in the Nevada desert. They accelerated without visible propulsion, changed direction without regard for inertia, and demonstrated capabilities that no known human technology could match. The object showed no heat signatures from engines, no exhaust plumes, no sonic booms despite apparent supersonic speeds. They moved exactly as Lazar had claimed. The sport model moved during test flights at S4. Military personnel began speaking openly about encounters that would have been career-ending admissions just years earlier. Commander David Fravor, the Navy pilot, who encountered the famous Tic-Tac object, described flight characteristics that seemed impossible according to known physics. The object he observed moved without any visible means of propulsion, accelerated instantaneously, without creating sonic booms, and demonstrated an apparent ability to anticipate his aircraft's movements. Perhaps most significantly, intelligence officials began acknowledging that some of these craft might represent technology not made on this world. In carefully worded statements and congressional briefings, government representatives admitted that the United States had recovered materials and possibly intact vehicles that appeared to be of non-human origin. While stopping short of explicitly confirming extraterrestrial visitation, these admissions represented the closest thing to official acknowledgement of alien technology the government had ever provided. The parallels to Lazar's 30-year-old testimony were impossible to ignore. He had described craft that moved without visible propulsion, that could accelerate instantaneously, that seemed to bend the laws of physics through advanced gravitational manipulation. UAPs documented in the Pentagon videos displayed exactly these characteristics, as if his descriptions from 1989 had been prophecies of what military personnel would eventually observe and record. Even more intriguing were the technical details about Element 115, the exotic material he claimed powered the alien propulsion systems. In 2003, Russian scientists successfully synthesized atoms with 115 protons, creating what would eventually be named moscovium on the periodic table. While these laboratory-created atoms were highly unstable, decaying within milliseconds, their very existence proved that Lazar's claims about undiscovered heavy elements had been scientifically plausible. The synthesis of element 115 represented a kind of vindication for Lazar's most specific technical claim. In 1989, when he first described this theoretical element, it existed only in scientific speculation. The fact that researchers later created atoms with exactly the atomic number he had specified suggested either remarkable prescience or access to information that was not publicly available at the time. Government acknowledgement of crashed retrieval programs provided another layer of retroactive credibility. Intelligence officials began referring to legacy programs that had been studying recovered materials for decades, exactly the kind of long-term reverse engineering efforts that Lazar had described at S4. While these programs were not explicitly confirmed to involve extraterrestrial materials, the language used to describe them was remarkably similar to what Lazar had claimed about his work. The establishment of new official investigation programs, including the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, represented a fundamental shift in government policy. Instead of debunking and dismissing reports, these programs were tasked with collecting and analyzing data about objects that displayed impossible flight characteristics. The transition from denial to investigation suggested that official attitudes toward these phenomena had undergone a profound transformation. For Bob Lazar, watching these developments from his quiet life in Nevada, the gradual official acknowledgement of impossible technologies must have carried a complex mixture of validation and frustration. After decades of ridicule and skepticism, the core elements of his testimony were being confirmed by the same government agencies that had once dismissed such claims as fantasy. Yet this vindication came without official acknowledgement of his specific experiences or formal restoration of his credibility. The scientific community, which had largely rejected Lazar's claims as violations of known physics, found itself confronting official evidence of technologies that seemed to operate exactly as he had described. The same flight characteristics that had made his testimony seem impossible in 1989 were now being documented by military sensors and confirmed by Pentagon officials. Researchers who had spent decades studying Lazar's claims began to see them in a new light. Details that had seemed like science fiction 30 years earlier now appeared remarkably prescient. His descriptions of biometric security systems, gravity wave propulsion, and stable super-heavy elements had all gained credibility through subsequent developments in technology and science. The implications extended far beyond vindication for any individual testimony. If the government truly possessed materials and technologies of non-human origin, as official statements increasingly suggested, then humanity's understanding of its place in the universe required fundamental revision. The possibility that advanced civilizations had been visiting Earth, leaving behind artifacts that human science was slowly learning to comprehend, transformed humanity from cosmic solitaries to participants in a larger galactic community. Yet even as official acknowledgement grew, many questions remained unanswered. The specific locations where recovered materials were being studied remained classified. The exact nature of the technologies being reverse-engineered was still protected by security classifications. The origin of the craft and materials, while increasingly acknowledged to be non-human, was still officially categorized as unknown rather than extraterrestrial. What had changed was the context in which Lazar's claims were evaluated. In 1989, his descriptions of impossible technologies had seemed like fantasy. In the 21st century, with official confirmation of similar phenomena, his testimony appeared remarkably consistent with documented reality. Whether he had witnessed the technologies he claimed to have studied, or simply possessed extraordinary insight into possibilities that science was only beginning to acknowledge, his voice had proven prophetic. As government disclosure continued its slow, cautious progress, Bob Lazar remained a quiet figure in the background of a story that had grown far beyond his individual testimony. The reluctant whistleblower who had once risked everything to share impossible knowledge had lived to see that knowledge become slightly less impossible. The desert still kept its deepest secrets, but the silence that had once surrounded them was finally beginning to break. More than 30 years have passed since Bob Lazar first stepped into the shadow of a television studio and spoke words that would forever change how the world thought about Area 51, government secrecy, and the possibility that we are not alone. In those 3 decades, his story has evolved from breaking news to cultural phenomenon to enduring mystery, outlasting countless other claims of extraordinary encounters and maintaining a persistence that defies simple explanation. The longevity of Lazar's narrative speaks to something deeper than mere fascination with flying saucers or government conspiracies. His testimony has survived, not because it offers easy answers, but because it poses questions that humanity cannot seem to stop asking. Questions about the nature of reality, the limits of scientific knowledge, and the possibility that the most extraordinary discoveries might be hidden behind walls of classification. In an age of rapidly evolving conspiracy theories and viral misinformation, Bob Lazar's story stands apart for its remarkable consistency. Unlike many extraordinary claims that grow more elaborate with each retelling, his testimony has remained essentially unchanged since 1989. The technical details he provided about gravity propulsion, S4's layout, element 115, and the craft characteristics have been repeated countless times across interviews and documentaries with no significant variations or embellishments. This consistency has become one of the most compelling aspects of his story. In the world of extraordinary claims, embellishment is almost inevitable. Yet Lazar has maintained the same basic account for decades, even when additional details might have made his story more convincing. The disciplined restraint he has shown suggests either remarkable self-control or genuine limitation to specific experiences. His apparent disinterest in capitalizing on his fame has further distinguished him from other figures who make extraordinary claims. Despite opportunities to write books, launch television series, or establish himself on the UFO conference circuit, Lazar has consistently avoided the commercial possibilities his notoriety could provide. When he does appear publicly, it is usually at the urging of documentary filmmakers rather than through his own promotional efforts. This reluctance to profit from his story has paradoxically enhanced its credibility. In a culture where extraordinary claims are often followed by book deals and speaking tours, Lazar's apparent desire to return to anonymity suggests motivations beyond personal gain. His continued operation of United Nuclear, selling scientific equipment rather than UFO merchandise, reinforces the impression of someone who would prefer to be known for conventional work rather than extraordinary claims. The rare public appearances he has made in recent years reveal a man who has aged into his role as keeper of impossible knowledge. Gone is the nervous energy of the young physicist, who first appeared as Dennis. In its place is quiet resignation, the demeanor of someone who has accepted that his story will never be fully believed or completely disproven. There is a weight to his presence now, the accumulated pressure of decades spent carrying knowledge that the world seems perpetually unprepared to accept. When pressed about the personal cost of his revelations, Lazar speaks with the measured cadence of someone who has had 30 years to consider the implications of his choices. He expresses no regret for speaking out, but acknowledges the naivety of expecting the world to respond rationally to extraordinary claims. His understanding of belief and skepticism has deepened through hard experience. Perhaps most significantly, Bob Lazar has become a symbol for a particular kind of truth-telling that exists outside conventional channels of authority. In an era when institutional credibility is increasingly questioned, his story represents the possibility that important knowledge might reside with individuals rather than organizations, that breakthrough discoveries might be hidden from rather than promoted by official sources. For younger generations encountering his story through modern media, Lazar represents something archetypal: the insider who risks everything to share forbidden knowledge, the scientist who values truth over security, the individual who stands against institutional power. Whether his specific claims are accurate becomes less important than what his story represents about the relationship between knowledge, power, and disclosure. This symbolic significance extends beyond the UFO community into broader discussions about government transparency, scientific authority, and the nature of expertise. Lazar's testimony raises fundamental questions about who decides what knowledge is safe for public consumption, how scientific discoveries should be shared, and whether extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence or simply honest evaluation. The scientific community's response has evolved subtly over the decades. While mainstream physicists continue to reject his claims about gravity manipulation, the tone of dismissal has generally softened. The synthesis of super-heavy elements in laboratories has vindicated his prediction that the periodic table extended beyond known boundaries. Recent government acknowledgements of unexplained aerial phenomena have made discussions of exotic propulsion slightly less taboo. Young scientists and engineers often encounter Lazar's testimony as they explore possibilities that mainstream science considers unlikely. His descriptions serve as inspiration for theoretical work that pushes boundaries of established knowledge. Whether accurate or not, his claims have contributed to a conceptual framework that encourages thinking beyond current limitations. In popular culture, Bob Lazar has achieved a unique form of immortality. References to Area 51, S4, and Element 115 appear regularly in science fiction films and novels. His story has become part of modern mythology surrounding government secrecy and extraterrestrial contact, providing narrative elements that resonate regardless of beliefs about his specific claims. The internet age has amplified his influence in ways that could not have been anticipated. Online communities analyzing his testimony have emerged, dissecting technical details and comparing claims with developments in physics and aerospace technology. YouTube documentaries, podcast discussions, and forum debates have introduced his story to audiences far larger than those who saw his original interviews. For many people, Bob Lazar represents something essential about the human condition: our desire to believe that reality is more extraordinary than it appears, that hidden knowledge exists beyond official acknowledgement, that individuals can possess insights that institutions overlook. His story taps into fundamental questions about trust, authority, and the possibility that our understanding of the universe is incomplete in profound ways. The endurance of his narrative suggests these questions resonate across cultural and generational boundaries. Each new audience discovers his testimony and must grapple with the same challenge: how to evaluate extraordinary claims that cannot be independently verified but cannot be definitively disproven. Wrestling with his story becomes a philosophical exercise about the nature of knowledge, belief, and truth. As Bob Lazar enters the later stages of his life, his role has evolved from active participant in UFO disclosure to elder statesmen of extraordinary claims. His influence extends beyond any specific testimony into broader discussions about how societies handle paradigm-shifting information, how individuals relate to institutional authority, and how scientific understanding advances. The desert wind still carries whispers of secrets buried in underground facilities, but Bob Lazar's legacy transcends any specific claims about recovered spacecraft. He has become a reminder that truth may sometimes reside in unexpected places, that extraordinary possibilities may hide behind walls of classification and skepticism, and that the courage to speak difficult truths may be more important than the comfort of accepted knowledge. Whether history ultimately vindicates or disproves his claims about S4 and alien technology, Bob Lazar has already secured his place in the ongoing human conversation about knowledge, mystery, and the possibilities that wait beyond the edges of accepted understanding. In a universe vast enough to contain wonders we have barely begun to imagine, his voice continues to whisper that the most extraordinary truths may be the ones we are not yet ready to hear. The Nevada desert tonight lies quiet beneath a canopy of ancient stars, the same stars that have watched over this landscape since long before humans walked the earth, long before a young physicist named Bob Lazar claimed to have glimpsed technologies that could rewrite our understanding of reality itself. The desert keeps its secrets well, holding them in the silence between wind and stone, between memory and mystery. Out here where the horizon stretches endlessly, the questions raised by Lazar's extraordinary testimony seem to hang suspended in the stillness. What lies hidden beneath the classified facilities scattered across this vast expanse? What technologies might exist beyond public knowledge, locked away in underground chambers where the impossible becomes routine? The wind moves across Papoose Lake tonight, stirring dust that may once have settled on craft of unknown origin, on materials that bend light and manipulate gravity. Bob Lazar's story has become part of this landscape now, woven into the fabric of mystery that surrounds Area 51 and the broader questions it represents. The desert remembers everything. It remembers the flash of atomic tests, the roar of experimental aircraft, the quiet conversations of scientists working with technologies they barely understood. In the silence of this vast landscape, we can almost hear the whispers of possibilities that wait just beyond our current understanding. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the image of this starlit desert, where the extraordinary and the ordinary exist, side by side. Let the questions settle gently in your mind like settling dust, not as problems to be solved immediately, but as invitations to wonder, to remain curious, to stay open to possibilities that stretch beyond the edges of current knowledge. The desert will keep its secrets through the night, as it has for millennia, but in the quiet hours before dawn, you may hear in the wind a whisper that suggests we are not alone, that answers exist beyond the horizon, and that the greatest discoveries often come to those who remain patient enough to listen and brave enough to wonder. Sleep well, and dream of stars.